All right, when you're the negative, you can run disadvantages, but if the affirmative team is not topical, meaning they're not following the resolution or their topic is outside of the grounds of the resolution, then you need to run topicality. Topicality is a formalized way of telling your judge that your affirmative team is not topical and therefore they should not win the round. Because remember, the affirmative team has the burden to prove, and they have to prove something that follows the resolution. They have to follow the resolution. Okay, so just like a disadvantage, topicality has 4 pieces. And again, you run topicality as the negative if the affirmative team is not topical. So topicality, when you run it, you choose one word or phrase from the resolution and show how the affirmative team is not meeting that phrase and not debating that part of the resolution. So first off, the first piece you have is the interpretation. Interpretation is where you define a word of the resolution. So, for example, if our resolution is the current one, the United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform in the United States in one or more of the following: forensic science, policing, and sentencing. If the affirmative is enacting criminal justice reform but not substantial, you can run topicality against substantial. So in my interpretation, I would say, I would start by saying topicality, substantial. Interpretation, substantial means blah, 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 blah. I would cite my definition, cite where I got it from. That would be my interpretation. I would interpret the word by defining it. If they were doing substantial criminal justice reform, but it was in a different category other than forensic science, policing, or sentencing, I would probably run topicality. Topicality, criminal justice reform areas, and I would say interpretation. I would say I would do a definition that defined maybe what they were doing or defined what policing, forensic science, and sentencing were. And then I would go to my next piece. Your next piece of your topicality, so you have interpretation, then you have violation. Your violation is how the affirmative team is not meeting that interpretation. So if we were doing substantial, my definition could be substantial means changing something by 50%. I could say violation, the affirmative team is not substantially doing criminal justice reform. They are only making changes to about 20% of the system. Therefore, they are not substantial because they're not meeting 50%. Okay, so you're showing how they don't meet your interpretation. If my interpretation was about defining policing, forensic science, and sentencing, I could say violation, the affirmative team is doing criminal justice reform in the form of lawmaking, and lawmaking does not fall under the categories of forensic science, policing, and sentencing. You just show how they don't meet your interpretation. The third piece, interpretation, violation, is standards. Standards are a set of reasons why the definition by the negative should be preferred in the round. Why these are reasons why we should care about this definition the most. So there are a lot of different standards. Usually you will choose 2 or 3 in your topicality shell. That's what this is called. So you could have multiple topicalities. Each one would have its own shell. So in this topicality shell, you choose 2 or 3 standards. And there are quite a bit of standards. So some of those standards include limits. Limits would be that this definition is better because it limits both teams to what's acceptable in the round. It sets terms on what's okay and what's not okay. You could do bright line, and bright line would say that this definition is better because it draws a clear distinction between what is topical and what is not topical. For substantial, what is topical would be 50% or more change in the system. Not topical would be 49.9% or less change in the system. Very bright line between the two. You could do education. Your definition is better because it allows both sides to gain a greater education on the topic. You could do fairness. Say the affirmative definition makes it too hard for one side to argue, and it's not fair that they didn't follow the resolution. You could do predictability. The affirmative's interpretation forces the negative to debate trivial issues that it is impossible to prepare for. Their case is not predictable because it doesn't follow the resolution. Therefore, the negative couldn't adequately prepare for it. You could do framers' intent. That means the people that wrote the topic intended for us to debate these issues, whereas the affirmative team is wanting us to debate these issues instead. So those are all standards, reasons why your definition is the best. And the final piece is voters. And voters are essentially why the judge should vote on this. Why should they care? And there are a couple different voters, just like standards, you choose like 2 or 3. One of them could be that it's a priority. Topicality is an a priori issue, and that means it's top priority, a priori, number 1 priority. If the affirmative team is not topical, then they've not fulfilled their number 1 priority and they should not win. They're not topical. We shouldn't have to debate the whole round and do all these other things that the negative wasn't prepared for, because that's the number 1 priority, is being topical. Another voter could be fairness. You can't, as the judge, you can't promote unfair treatment by allowing the affirmative to break the rules of the debate and run an untopical case. That's not fair to the negative team. You could do education. Debate's supposed to be about education, and we can learn only by being able to debate the cases that we can prepare for and argue effectively. As the judge, you should not vote for a case that harms the education of debaters. You could do predictability. Affirmative interpretation forces the negative to debate trivial issues that it's impossible to prepare for. So as you might have noticed, some of the standards are similar to some of the voters. So standards are reasons why you should prefer. They could also be reasons why the judge should vote for this. But if you can have different standards than your voters, that's going to make the strongest. So the standards I like the best: limits, ground, fairness, framers' intent, predictability, bright line. Voters I like fairness, education, a priori, and predictability. So in Topicality, you kind of piece it all together, and you can kind of do this on the spot. As the affirmative's reading their untopical case, you're preparing at your desk, one partner's flowing, one partner's writing their Topicality shell. You choose your definition out of your files to show this is what a good definition of the word is. Write down how they violate it. Literally, it's your own words, how they violate that definition. Choose which standards you want to use, pop them on your document, and you're ready to run your Topicality shell. Now, the affirmative could be untopical in many different ways. So they could be untopical because they're not substantial. They also then could not be topical because they could be doing something outside of forensic science, policing, and sentencing. They thirdly could not be topical because they could be dealing with the United States and Canada's government together, whereas the topic just says the United States federal government. So you could run 2 or 3 Topicality shells, all focusing on a different word of the resolution. That would be okay. Because if the affirmative team is not topical, you're going to have a lot harder time of running a disadvantage, because your disadvantages are prepared for topical cases, not untopical cases. So sometimes if they're untopical, you might only be able to run Topicality. You might be able to run a generic disadvantage, which doesn't kind of applies to the whole topic and not a specific case. But you should always run Topicality if the affirmative team is not topical. As the affirmative, to answer Topicality, you're going to do a few things. First, you want to say you have 2 options. You can say, we meet their definition, and then you're going to prove how you meet the definition and how you don't violate. You don't do their violation, okay? And then you would show how you meet the standards and the voters, because you do meet their definition. You do need to have your own definition or meet their definition. The second way is by doing a counter interpretation. So their interpretation says this word, this definition. Your counter interpretation is saying, no, substantial is not 50%. Substantial means there's a large positive outcome. And then you show how you meet that, and that should be preferred, that description, that interpretation, over the negatives interpretation. Okay, so you wouldn't violate their interpretation. Your interpretation is better, and you show why. And you show how your interpretation is better for their standards. Okay, you're going to say this interpretation is actually better for education because it allows for more things to be talked about. It's better for fairness because there were files. We all got files on this case area. It is following the framer's intent. And then you can say voting is, or topicality is a voting issue, but we are topical, and this is why you should vote for the affirmative, or this issue shouldn't be a voting issue, because if the affirmative can't win the round just by being topical. That should be assumed. Okay, so you want to say this isn't a voting issue. You should focus on the rest of the round. Okay, so that is topicality, and that is how you answer it. And you'll be getting a topicality file, which has a lot of definitions. And then you will choose the definitions in round, add your voters, add your standards, write up your violation. Okay.